Greetings everyone. Welcome to the first lecture for the course IE 306 Supply Chain and Logistics Management. I am Matthew Baby, Assistant Professor with the Department of Mechanical Engineering at Rajagiri School of Engineering and Technology. In this first lecture, we would try and understand the essentials or the fundamentals of supply chain and logistics management. We would discuss what supply chains are, the typical structure and the stages involved in a supply chain in this first lecture. To start off with, it is essential that we understand what a supply chain is before we start discussing the tools and techniques involved in supply chain management. So, what is a supply chain? A supply chain essentially is nothing but a chain or a sequence of all parties or entities involved in fulfilling a customer request or a demand. For any organization which are service providers or product providers, they are aimed at a certain consumer, a target market. So when a consumer makes a request for a particular product or a service, the manufacturer has to procure the required parts, make the product, and then think about shipping this particular product to reach the consumer at the required time. So there are a sequence of activities involved in between placing an order for a particular product by a consumer and the receipt of the product, finished product by the consumer. And to fulfill all these sequence of activities, there are a large number of entities involved in this particular process. So a chain of all these entities or parties which are involved in fulfilling a particular consumer's request or demand is what we refer to as a supply chain. And a supply chain essentially consists of the customers, retailers, distributors, wholesalers or warehouses, transporters, manufacturers and suppliers. Okay, so the starting point of a supply chain is basically the customer. The customer who is the one who actually triggers a request or an order or a demand. He is the one who actually places an order or places the demand for a product or places a request for a product, right? So he is always an essential and integral part of the supply chain, because any supply chain is basically aimed at fulfilling a consumer demand or a request. So consumers or customers are a very integral part of the supply chain. That is basically the end of the supply chain. The supply chain generally, in most cases, in general ends with customers. Okay, so it always consists of customers. Then there might be people who are directly involved in selling products to the end users. We call them as retailers. Okay, customers, they buy their products usually from retailers, in most cases from retailers. I can give you examples for retailers. The shops that you go and buy products from, most of the cases they are retailers. The supermarkets that you go and buy products from, they are retailers. Okay, so they are involved in selling products to the end user. That is why we generally call them as retailers. So they are the ones who generally, in most cases, come in direct contact with the consumers. So they deal with small quantity of sales. That means not in total, but individual consumers, they buy their products in small quantities directly from retailers. Then other integral part of the supply chain might be wholesalers, distributors or warehouses. Now these are intermediaries which basically buy their products from manufacturers and supply it to the retailers as and when required. So they are involved in bulk purchasing of items from the manufacturer. They are involved in storaging them. That means they are involved in inventory management. They keep them as inventory, they store them and distribute to the retailers as and when required. So their distributors, wholesalers, or warehouses are nothing but intermediaries that help in distributing the products from the manufacturer to the retailer. Okay. Then there are the manufacturers. These are the people who are involved in converting raw materials or subcomponents into the products that are required by the consumer. So they are also an essential part of the supply chain, because without the manufacturer, no products are there. So if no products are there, then we cannot meet a consumer demand. That's why they are also an integral part of the supply chain. Okay. And finally, there are suppliers who supply raw materials as well as sub-assemblies which are required by the manufacturer to make their particular product or service. So the suppliers sell raw materials or subcomponents or assemblies to manufacturers. Manufacturers put these things together or processes the raw materials and converts it into a finished product. And this finished product might be taken up by wholesalers or distributors and stored in warehouses, which will be later on distributed towards retailers. And from the retailers, generally consumers buy their products according to their requirement. Okay. In between all these, there are people who are involved in transportation of these goods, physical transportation of these goods. Okay. So such kinds of people are what we refer to as transporters. They are also an essential part of the supply chain, because without the transporters, transportation of the product from the manufacturer to the wholesaler, or wholesaler to the retailer, or retailer to the consumer might not be possible. For example, a retailer might have a home delivery service. Okay. For them, that to happen, there should be some kind of people or certain amount of people involved in transportation of that good from the store to the consumer's house. So transporters are essential parts of supply chain. Okay. Now it is not essential that all of these elements are there in a supply chain. Certain supply chains won't have distributors or wholesalers, okay, or retailers. The manufacturer sells a product directly to the consumer, or consumer makes an order directly to the manufacturer. Such kinds of supply chains also exist. Now all the elements or entities that you see listed out over here need not be part of the supply chain. It is up to the organization to decide which all elements or which all entities are part of their supply chain. Okay, we'll deal in depth about these concepts and how to design these supply chain networks later on in the coming modules. Okay, so within an organization that is part of supply chain, for example, say the manufacturer here, the supply chain includes all the functions which are involved in receiving and fulfilling a consumer request. So just like above, let us what I said previously. Let's take the case of a manufacturer. Okay, the manufacturer will have various departments or various functions within the organization which are involved in receiving and fulfilling a consumer request. All of these functions become part of the supply chain. So in the case of manufacturer, these may include product development function, the marketing function, the operations, finance, distribution, and customer service function, etc. Now we have an example for a supply chain. Okay, a consumer or a customer has a need for an electronic good, say a tablet or a mobile phone. Now he might visit an electronic retailer like Lulu Connect, Reliance Digital, or Walmart for that matter. Okay, I'm giving you examples at different levels. Lulu Connect is something that is common to the locale of Kerala, specifically the locale of Cochin. Okay, and Reliance Digital is one that is more widespread throughout the entire nation, and Walmart as a whole is one global retailer chain. So any consumer having a request for an electronic good, he usually either visits an e-website or he goes to the retailer in most cases. So a consumer, he triggers a demand, he visits a retailer. The retailer is basically a person who stocks in itself, okay, the required products as inventory, which are supplied from distributor or warehouses. Okay, so the retailer buys the products from distributors or warehouses, and these products are transported to the retailer using trucks, and the trucks it might be supplied by a third party. Now the distributor might have their own trucks, okay, to transport the goods to the retailer, or if it doesn't, if that particular organization distributor doesn't have their own transportation, they can arrange for third party transporters to take care of that particular logistics. Okay, the distributor in turn stocks the products from the manufacturer. He buys the products from the manufacturer and keeps them in stock in bulk volumes, very large quantities. Okay, and he sells them in smaller units or smaller quantities to the retailers as and when they require it. And the retailers, they order from the distributor when consumers buy the products from them and they go low on their inventory for a particular item. So the manufacturer themselves, they receive raw materials from suppliers, right? They receive raw materials, or they might receive sub components or sub assemblies that are required for their product. So, and the suppliers themselves might have to be supplied by lower tier suppliers. For example, if a supplier is involved in manufacturing a particular component for a product, okay, the component might require certain other materials. So any supplier themselves might be supplied by even lower tier suppliers. And this is a basic example for a supply chain. Now in a supply chain, essentially there are large number of transactions or flows involved. Okay, now these flows can be both in both directions. It can be either a forward flow or a backward flow. There is no specific direction. It can be in both directions. So the major three flows or transactions that are seen in any supply chain are the product flow, the information flow, or the money or funds flow. Okay, the product flow is generally from the supplier to the manufacturer to the distributor to the retailer and then to the consumer. That's the order in which the product usually flow. Okay, generally in the forward direction, the product flow. Then there is information flow. In any supply chain, there is an information flow. For example, consumer. He comes to the retailer, he asks for a product. That's an information flow from the consumer to the retailer. The retailer can provide the information to the consumer, saying that he can publish an advertisement saying that these products are available at these much prices. That is also consumer, that's a communication or an information flow from the retailer to the consumer. That's why I told these flows can be either forward or backward. Okay, so generally product flow is in the forward direction, and information flows can be both forward and backward flow. Okay, and then there is a money flow, money or funds flow. The consumer pays for a particular product, right? It is that particular money that is used to pay the distributor for the products that the retailer bought from the distributor, right? So there is always a money exchange that takes place between all the elements or entities in that particular supply chain. So there is always a money or fund flow also involved. So there are basically these three flows or these three transactions involved in any supply chain. Okay, and these transactions or flows can be in both directions, either forward or backward. So the essential flows involved in the supply chain are product flow, information flow, or money and exchange, sorry, money or fund flows. Now the above schematic represents the typical structure of a supply chain. Okay, so it consists of a supplier, manufacturer, distributor, retailer, and a consumer. And the supply chain always consists of essentially the manufacturer and the consumer, because these are the most basic entities of any supply chain in most cases. The consumer is the most important part of any supply chain. The basic objective of supply chain is to meet consumer demand, right? So the arrows here, they basically point towards the direction of general product flow. We're talking about the flow of materials or the product in general. Okay, as I told you, in a supply chain there can be three kinds of flows. There can be flow of products, okay, then can be flow of information and flow of cash, money on funds, right? So generally the product flow is what is typically represented in any supply chain diagram. So any typical supply chain representation schematics that are given, they usually have arrows which indicate the general product flow directions. So suppliers supply raw materials or subcomponents to manufacturers. Manufacturers convert these raw materials and subcomponents into finished products. Okay, they are distributed towards the consumer through distributors or wholesalers or retailers. Okay, these are basically distributors or wholesalers and retailers are basically intermediaries involved in the transfer of the finished product to the consumers. They are not essential parts of the supply chain. Certain supply chains do not have distributors or retailers. The consumer directly places order to the manufacturer and the manufacturer directly delivers the product to the consumer. Okay. Now in the particular transportation element, you might have a transporter. So in the transportation of goods from the manufacturer distributor, this arrow that during that particular product flow, you might have transporters which are third parties. Okay, if the manufacturer themselves have their own logistics facility with their own transportation facilities, then there is no requirement for a third party. Okay, third party transporter to be there. So essentially, this is what a supply chain looks like. Now, in this particular supply chain that is represented over here, you can see that this manufacturer is supplied by two suppliers. Okay, and this supplier is again supplied by two sub-suppliers. So this is not a typical structure for any chain. Any chain will have basically a one-to-one connection. This is not the case. You can see that this manufacturer is connected to two suppliers. Okay. Similarly, a distributor can also distribute a particular product to more than one retailer. So essentially, the term supply chain is not actually an accurate description. What would be a more accurate or appropriate term would be a supply web or a supply network. So in this example, you can see that the manufacturer may receive from more than one supplier and then supply to several distributors. Okay, at the same time, the distributor might supply to several retailers as well. Thus, the term supply network or supply web is more accurate than a supply chain. Okay, but it is in common usage that we use the term supply chain. It is not actually a chain but rather a supply network. That is why in the coming module we'll talk about design of supply networks, not supply chains. Okay, so this is a typical representation of a typical supply. Now there are several stages in a supply chain structure. Okay, now this is an example of where we see multiple number of suppliers, multiple number of manufacturers, distributors, retailers, and consumers. Okay, so there are basically essentially 5 stages in a supply chain structure. Okay, you can see this the first stage called the supply stage. Then there is a manufacturer stage, a distributor stage, a retailer stage, and a customer stage. Okay, and the arrows indicate the flow of products, generally the flow of products. So take the case of this particular manufacturer. This manufacturer has 3 suppliers, the first one, the second one, and the third one. Okay, they deliver their products to 3 distributors, the first distributor here, second distributor here, and the third distributor here. And this distributor again delivers the products, okay, from this particular manufacturer to 3 different retailers, right? And this retailer, which is supplied by the distributor here, again supplies the same products to 3 different consumers. Okay, so a supply chain is basically a very complex network, and any typical supply chain structure consists of these 5 stages. Okay, generally these 5 stages, some of these stages may or may not be present as per the design requirements of that particular organization. So any supply chain structure will contain a stage of suppliers, a stage of manufacturers, a stage of distributors, a stage of retailers, and a stage of consumers. Okay, and essentially there are 2 minimum stages in any supply chain. That's the consumer and the manufacturer. The distributor might not be there, the retailer might not be there. The manufacturer can sell their products directly to the consumer. You can see it flow like this. Okay, hope you can see that. So that is also possible. Clear? So these are the supply chain stages. So as I discussed in the previous figure, The typical supply chain includes various stages like the customer stage, the retailer stage, the wholesaler or distributor stage, the manufacturer stage, and the raw material or component supplier stage. Now, each stage is connected through product flow, information flow, and fund flow. Okay, there is these three different flows which connect each of these stages, and these flows are managed by either of these intermediary, either of these stages. Say for example, the stage between the consumer and the retailer. Okay, the payment between the flows between the consumer and retailer, it might be managed by either the retailer or the consumer. Okay, in certain cases it might not be managed by either of these components or stages, but rather a third party or an intermediary who's been appointed to carry out that particular transaction on behalf of both these parties. Okay, so each of these stages in a typical supply chain is connected through the flow of products, information, as well as funds or money. Okay, and these flows can be managed by the either of these parties involved or an intermediary. For example, take the case of product flow. Okay, a delivery to home service. A consumer calls up a retailer and asks for a particular product to be uh, made available to them or delivered to them. The consumer, once he places an order, he has to make a payment. For that, he uses his card. Okay, and there are these online banking systems. So these banking systems, they take care of the fund transfer. So it is not managed by the retailer or the consumer, but rather an intermediary. That's a banking system in between, right? So the fund transfer is managed there by an intermediary. And once that order is confirmed and the payment has been made, then that particular order might be delivered to the consumer by the retailer themselves using their own delivery trucks or delivery vehicles. Okay, so that is a product flow. The product taken from the retailer goes to the consumer, and that particular product flow is managed by the retailer themselves. So that is why I say that every stage in a supply chain is connected through a product flow, information flow, and fund flow. And these flows are managed by either of these stages or a third party appointed to work on behalf of these two stages. So the supply chain structures may vary according to the consumer needs and the roles played by the stages involved. Okay. So if the consumer needs are very technical, very specific, which only the manufacturer themselves can understand, usually the retailers and wholesalers are avoided from the supply chain. Okay, so based upon the consumer needs and the nature of the product, the supply chain structure varies. Similarly, the role played by the stage involved. Okay, so in some countries, wholesalers and distributors are not at all relevant because the retailer market has been is so consolidated that wholesalers and distributors, they just add to the cost of the supply chain. They do not give you any benefits. Okay, so in such cases, such as in the case of US, okay, wholesalers and distributors might not be there, and you directly manufacture sells directly the product to the retailers. So it's based upon the consumer needs and the roles played by the stages involved that basically determine which are the stages that are present in a supply chain structure. An example for this as to how consumer needs and roles played by the stages involved affect the supply chain structure is given below. Take the case of Dell. Now, Dell has two different supply chain structures for two different businesses. For their server business, now servers are basically a much more customized version, customized and technical product. Okay, for their server business, Dell opts for a supply chain structure where there are no retailers or distributors involved. Okay, and the consumer places the demand directly to the manufacturer, that is Dell. So if you have a requirement for a server and you want to buy it from Dell, their server business generally has a structure where the consumer meets the company, the manufacturer Dell themselves directly and places an order with them, because the product is much more technical, okay, and it is customizable in nature. So this becomes easier when the company manages this particular business themselves without any intermediaries like retailers or distributors. Similarly, Dell, in their consumer product business like laptops, tablets, etc., they use retailers and distributors to get their products to the final end consumer. So a same company, for two different products, they use two different types of supply chain structures. Okay, so that is how the consumer need, the nature of the product, and the role played by the stages. Okay, if the role played by a retailer or distributor is negligible, then it is generally a case that you see that those stages are avoided, and the manufacturer sells a product directly to the consumers. Okay, so when we talk about supply chain structure, a supply chain structure is not always fixed. It changes or it varies according to consumer needs, the product nature, and the roles played by the stages involved. Okay, and any typical supply chain structure consists of 5 stages: a consumer stage, a retailer stage, a wholesaler stage, a distributor stage, a manufacturer stage, and a supply stage.